Alrighty. Hello everyone and welcome back to PS Platypus. Today we're going to be having a look at some histology, specifically focusing on the endocrine glands, having a look at the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, and the adrenal glands. So to start off with, we're going to have a look at the pituitary gland. And with the pituitary gland, you have a couple of important histological landmarks and points to keep in mind. So with your anterior pituitary, the first thing you have to know is the different names it's given to it. So one name that it can also be called by is the pars distalis. And embryologically, because it's derived from the oral ectoderm, it consists more of glandular tissue and therefore is called the adenohypophysis. Adeno referring to the glandular component of it. The posterior pituitary instead is derived from the floor of the diencephalon, which is a nervous tissue, and therefore is called a neurohypophysis. The neuro referring to the fact that it comes from nervous tissue. So those are the two important things you have to keep in mind. The next thing you have to know is the different histological cell types that come up. So with histology, you can see a couple of different cell types come up with the anterior pituitary. You see acidophils, and these acidophils, they sort of stain a faded pink, whereas the basophils instead stain a more opaque red or pink stain. So the acidophil, I think you can appreciate on this diagram as well, is a bit more faded than the basophil is, and it's a bit of a different color as well. Whereas the chromophobe, that stains more translucent than the other cell types, and doesn't stain very well at all. Whereas the lumina is referring to the white space that fills everything surrounding these cells. Now, these cell types play different roles. So the acidophils, as shown in this diagram, play a role of secreting growth hormone and prolactin, whereas the basophils, they secrete things like TSH, ACTH, FSH, or LH. So just again, to reiterate that, acidophils, they come in two different types, somatotrophs and lactotrophs. The somatotrophs are the ones that are going to be secreting hormones that regulate body growth. So somato referring to body, growth hormone is what they secrete. Lactotrophs are again going to be secreting hormones responsible for or regulating lactation, and therefore they're the ones that secrete prolactin. So growth hormone and prolactin are secreted by acidophils of somatotroph and lactotroph type. I hope that makes sense. Whereas with the basophils, that comes in three different flavors. So you have thyrotrophs that are going to secrete TSH, gonadotrophs that secrete FSH and LH that play a very complex role in regulating the gonads, and corticotrophs which secrete ACTH, and that's the third and final basophil type. All right. Now we're going to take a look at the posterior pituitary. It's got a very different structure under microscope. So in red, you can see over here, it's staining pretty intense red, are those blood vessels that pass through the nervous tissue. And you also have in purple, the nucleus of the pituocytes that exist here. And you can also appreciate something called herring bodies, which represent the neuron axon terminals. So all three components can be seen on the image here. Just important that you know how the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary look different and what the rough histological characteristics of each are. All right. And going back, sorry, with those unmyelinated axons, they contain the hormones that will be released by the posterior pituitary following stimulation. So that's another important thing, is knowing where the hormones lie as well. So we already covered with the anterior pituitary, how they lie inside the acidophils, basophils, whereas with the posterior pituitary, they lie within the unmyelinated axons. All right, now we come to the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland essentially looks very, very distinct histologically. It's got these large follicles separated by a single layer of squamous or cuboidal epithelial cells. And these epithelial cells we often call the follicular or principal or just epithelial cells of the thyroid. And they have a very important role, which is to produce thyroglobulin, a protein that is going to be responsible for eventually becoming T3 and T4, our thyroid hormones. So it produces a thyroglobulin, then secretes that into the follicles for storage. And then what can happen is iodine, which is in the bloodstream, will be able to enter those epithelial cells, enter into the lumen of these follicles, aka these colloids, and then essentially bind to the the tyrosine groups on thyroglobulin and allow it to form T3 and T4. So what happens is that thyroglobulin bound to the iodine is then kept inside either the follicle or it's kept inside the epithelial cells. And then when it comes time to release it, the T3 and T4 is cleaved off and secreted into systemic circulation to affect all of the cells in the body and produce effects like increasing basal metabolic rate. And besides that, various other things like stimulating growth as well. So that's one of the cell types, the follicular, principal, epithelial, thyroid cells, whatever you want to call them. They form a single epithelial layer surrounding those follicles. But then you also have what's called C cells or clear cells. And these are parafollicular, so they exist between the follicles. And they have a different role, which is to produce calcitonin. And that works in an opposing action to the parathyroid hormone. So it inhibits bone resorption. And that's another important cell type you have to be aware of. So they might point to a cell that exists between these follicles, and you have to know that they're referring to a C cell, clear cell, parafollicular cell, whatever you want to call it. And then we come to our final histology slide, which is referring to the adrenal glands. And this is a very high yield, important slide to know about. So with the adrenal glands, it's got a couple of very important layers. What we're going to do is to make it a bit more clear to understand, we're going to start on the very outside and work our way in. So on the very outside, with any sort of visceral structure, with any organ, you might have some connective tissue that connects it to the nearby spaces. So yeah, might have some adipocytes that you might see or not see at all, depending on the staining. You then have the adrenal capsule, and those are sort of collagen fibers that you can sort of appreciate on this image, but not that much. And then you have the actual adrenal cortex. And so that's composed of three different layers or three different zones, the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Now, the good thing is the names of these zones sort of reflect how they appear as well. So the zona glomerulosa refers to the layer which has sort of ball-like glomeruli. If you have a look at our renal histology video, you'll know what we mean by glomerulus and what they look like. You can't really see it on here because we're pretty zoomed out from the individual cells, so it's hard to appreciate that structure. But it is that layer up there. And then you have the zona fasciculata, and that's composed of fasciculated structure. So what does that mean? Well, that means sort of cords and strips, which you can kind of see in the way that the cells are arranged in that layer. Probably the most important thing you have to know, though, about that layer is that it's the thickest layer, and it's composed of these foamy white cells. So you can see very clearly that there's a foamy white layer separating the top and the bottom. And the reason it's foamy white is that it contains lipids, specifically steroids, because it's going to be releasing glucocorticoids into the circulation. And I'll talk about what each of these layers does in a second as well. And then you have zona reticularis, which is composed of more reticular fibers. And that's where you can see a more fine distinction between the cell types. So you can sort of see how with that final zone, the cells are more easily distinguishable from each other compared to the other zones. And that's why it's called a zona reticularis. And then finally, we have the adrenal medulla, where there's chromaffin cells, and these are modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons that are going to be used to produce adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is going to enter the vascular supply around the cells. Now, let's talk about these different zones in a bit more detail. The zona glomerulosa, its role is to secrete mineralocorticoids. Zona fasciculata is going to secrete glucocorticoids, and the zona reticularis is going to secrete androgens. And the way you can remember that, a handy little like mnemonic or memory device that was taught to me is salt, sugar, sex. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So the outermost layer is salt. So again, with salt, think about regulating your water in the body and salt levels and electrolyte levels, and think of mineralocorticoids and things like aldosterone and the role that they play in regulating salt. Then for sugar, think about, again, things like cortisol and glucocorticoids that are going to play an important role in also regulating your body sugar, amongst other things that they do. And then you have the zona reticularis, the final layer, responsible for producing sex hormones, the androgens. And that's how you remember roughly what these three different layers do. And that's pretty much it for histology. If you have any questions, concerns, feedback, or if you'd like more details or anything we covered in these slides, please let me know and we'll try and get back to you. Otherwise, that's it for today, and we'll see you in the next one.